Hello and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums, movies, games, books, you name it. The only rule is that we are only allowed to discuss things in terms of the story. Mechanics, art, animation, any of that, all of that's off limits unless it pertains directly to how the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford, author, employee 427, and also your host, and today I'm joined once more by John Kernan.
Hi, I forgot my employee number, but don't tell them, because every time I say that, they hurt me.
Wow. This got dark quickly.
I mean, they mostly hurt me by demanding another day of Mariah Carey playing in my section of the office on the speakers.
Wait a date when we recorded this. So, as I said in the previous episode, this cycle is kind of a bit experimental compared to a lot of the other ones we've done. That is especially true of this episode, to the point that I'm genuinely unsure of how good a job we're going to do to stick to our big rule. And that is because today we're discussing The Stanley Parable, which is a truly bizarre game created by Davey Redden and William Pugh, originally released in 2013, and then re-released with a bunch of extra content in 2022, which horrified me. I did not realize it was that long ago that it was originally released.
Oh yeah.
So for those
so young,
honestly, for those of you who don't know, The Stanley Parable is, at a glance, the story of the life of an ordinary office worker, Stanley, as he experiences an unusual and unnerving break from the typical tedium of his workday, guided, of course, by the ever-helpful voice of the narrator. However, because Stanley is actually controlled by the player, he can ignore the narrator's direction, and things kind of begin to go off script and off the rails very quickly from there. And that's kind of why this is a bit of a weird one for us to handle on this particular podcast, because to say the Stanley Parable has a story is not entirely accurate. It's kind of a stretch, to be honest. It's less of a proper story and more of a meta-narrative, meaning a story that's more concerned with exploring the themes and nature of storytelling than the actual story being told. This one, in its original incarnation, was focused on choice, both in the context of gaming and reality. And then the re-release adds like a secondary layer dealing with the validity of sequels and the expectations of fan bases and creators alike when it comes to those releases, which is very cool. Both versions, there's also like a bunch of other smaller little themes depending on like which story route you end up in. Things like motivation, escapism, the passage of time, isolation, and just the freaky and subliminal spaces.
Yeah, I actually forgot about the re-release. I gotta look into that more.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like they add a bunch of content that it like does a lot to change the like focus of the message of the game. Like all the choice stuff is still in there, but suddenly a lot of the additional stuff is all like commentary about soulless sequels and remakes. By virtue of being a mostly hollow remake that offers quotation marks many hours of new content, and most of that content is just going, man, remember how good the first one was? So they've like made a remake that was just a soulless remake, cashing in on the original to make a comment about soulless remakes cashing in on the original. Very on brand for the kind of writing you can expect from the Stanley Parable. I was not joking when I said that they go all in on the meta-narrative thing. So yeah, but that's the sequel. That's the sequel. The first one is very focused on choice, and specifically the illusion of choice. Because in the context of a game, even the games that give you like that are very open world and make you feel like you have a million options, like the Stanley Parable, ultimately every choice is something that is then put in there as an option. Every possible ending is a sort of foregone conclusion.
There's no such thing as true freedom in a video game. None of it can ever exist on its own. None of it's natural or truly organic, so...
True, but I think like part of... Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I just mean that's one of the funny things where the choice is usually, even in good games, the choice is at least partially an illusion. It's just a matter of if it's a good illusion.
Oh, well, I was thinking, it's funny that well, no, I don't think funny is the right word. It was clearly a very intentional choice to give the character Stanley this very menial, mundane, dull, boring job. The sort of job that people think of and go, okay. No offense to anyone who, of course, works in an office, but, for a lot of people, myself included, not really a first choice. And as far as an environment goes, it's one that most of us associate with tedium. And I think that was kind of on purpose to sort of illustrate that our choices in life aren't necessarily as much choice as we like to think either. Because when it comes down to it, for most people, you've got to work. You've got to go in and sort of grind that tedious workload through the day. And you've got to keep doing it because it's kind of essential to your continued survival in modern society.
Yeah, so letting yourself be too averse to it only makes things worse.
That it does, and these things. This thing with choice is illustrated in other places too. There's the infamous baby game where you have the choice to sit there and save the fictional baby, fictional both in and out of universe, for 4 hours, or you can accept it and just let the thing burn, for example.
Oh, I saw a little bit of that one. That one was funny.
Yeah, that one is a big one. There's the introduction of the scoreboard that comes in as part of that whole plot line. Deals a lot with motivation, which I think ties into choice a lot, because what motivates you is going to influence the choices you make, which is again another commentary about how much freedom of choice there actually is when making a decision. But the baby one, for example, it's called a choice, but rare is the kind of person who could actually sit there for the full 4 hours just endlessly clicking that button to reset the baby.
I would go insane.
I would not last more than 10 minutes, tops. But it's exactly that sort of thing. It's the same thing as with Stanley's situation. You have this really tedious task that, technically speaking, you don't have to do. Or rather, it's a choice to continue doing it. But it's kind of a foregone conclusion unless you set up a bot or something to do it for you. You're not going to sit there clicking for 4 hours.
Yeah, and there's ultimately no normal way around it, because the only way not to do it is to go out of your way to do anything else.
Pretty much, yeah. So there's your 2 iterations of the game. We talked about them in reverse order. I don't think it really matters. You've got the first one, which is all about this idea of choice. The idea of choices in storytelling, specifically the storytelling of video games. And to a somewhat lesser extent, just choices in reality. And you've then, of course, got the second one, which we established is a very clever way of commenting on the industry's tendency to just constantly churn out soulless remasters and remakes and sequels that are lacking in not necessarily content, but in what's the right word here? It's
substance.
Substance. There we go.
Yeah, it's rough for a lot of them. Stanley Parable can get away with it as long as it still makes you laugh.
I mean, the Stanley Parable gets away with it in part, I think, partly because it brought the game to a very niche game back to people's attention, and partly because of the statements it's making. The Stanley Parable definitely lives up to its name, in that it very much is a parable. It is a very simple story being used to communicate some pretty complex philosophical and or moral ideas.
Oh yeah. And of course, the core of the game is the narrator.
Exactly. I was sort of about to get into that, actually. Because at this point, I feel like our audience may well be wondering why we're talking about meta-narratives and just the general gist of these games, and have not once really, well, briefly, but other than that, at the very beginning, haven't really talked about the narrator. But the reality is that the Stanley Parable as a game wouldn't function without the narrator. Not just
Every
because,
single thing you do in this game is to see what it's going to make the narrator say.
honestly, that is completely true. Like, the biggest motivating factor is, how is this character going to react? But on top of that, the narrator is just in general what prompts you into action to do things. It's a twofold thing here. The narrator is your source of motivation in two different ways. It's simultaneously the thing that gives you the push to start interacting with the game, and then it's also your reward for playing the game and doing different things, and is to see what the narrator's going to say, because the narrator is very funny and doesn't like you.
No. I mean, he's probably pretty neutral on you at first, but, like, that's, I'm pretty sure, the best you can get. If you do the straightforward path, do exactly what he tells you, exactly what you're supposed to do, he's probably very neutral on you. I wouldn't be surprised. I don't actually remember that bit because nobody ever wants to do it. But, I'm sure he calls you boring if you just do exactly what you're supposed to, because the narrator is very sassy.
I don't think he does, actually. I think you can just play through the narrator's intended storyline within the context of the game if you want. And it's just one of the endings you can get. To say the narrator doesn't like you isn't entirely accurate, because the narrator, his personality is very volatile. Not in the sense of aggressive, but in the sense of it shifts very dramatically depending on the story route you end up following. Your actions, or Stanley's actions, I should say, that you are creating directly inform the narrator's personality, or at least his attitude towards Stanley.
My favorite is always the very, very exasperated, just on the edge of giving up narrator who doesn't know why he's here.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the thing. Like, you can see him go from completely neutral to angry to just so tired. Like, there comes a point where he is just so done and starts questioning what the point of anything is. Like, why did he bother creating this story for you, Stanley? It's such a waste of effort when you won't interact with it. Like, why is his life like this? But he's also attached to Stanley and dependent on Stanley in other like routes if you follow through. There's one where it just ends with Stanley standing there and you viewing things from the narrator's perspective as he's desperately trying to get Stanley's attention, and Stanley just stays still and he kind of has an existential despair moment to the narrator.
It's so fun.
Yeah, the narrator is very much a character in his own right, and I would argue that even though the narrator outright says that this is a game about Stanley, the reality is that it is not, because the narrator is very much the star of the show.
Yeah, it's more like, what happens if you make a narrator not just a character, but essentially a person who is not telling the audience what the story is, but is telling the audience what the story is supposed to be, while there is no rigid structure actually making sure things go the way he says.
Yeah, I mean, because in the context of the game, the story that you are playing out as Stanley is a story that has been crafted by the narrator.
But he can't actually make Stanley do a damn thing.
Yeah, and in fact, like, the narrator, in some storylines, right, the narrator realizes that this is not Stanley as he knows Stanley. There is another force piloting Stanley. There is the player. And that makes sense to him, because within the context of that world, he expects Stanley to follow conventional wisdom.
He has seen Stanley before, ostensibly until we started the game. Stanley was a very normal, maybe even white bread man who came to work every day, did his job, and went home.
Yeah, and suddenly Stanley stops following conventional wisdom and starts doing things completely off the rails, like, jumping from a lift and risking serious injury just because he can to see what happens. And it clicks for the narrator. He sort of goes, "Oh, I see." And then he starts trying a bunch of tactics to get you, the player, instead of Stanley, back on track, trying to justify it in terms of the story. And suddenly, the game shifts very dramatically, and it's no longer the narrator interacting with Stanley, it's the narrator interacting with the player, breaking the fourth wall.
The meta-narrative goes from subtext to text.
Yeah, in an instant.
Gotta love
suddenly it's not Stanley's choices that are being questioned. The narrator is now questioning your choices as a player and saying, why are you doing this? Why are you playing the game like this? There is an actual narrative here that you could be enjoying. I have worked hard on this narrative for Stanley and by extension for you. Which is a thing with open world games, right? The way that they are written is that a lot of the time they do have an overarching plot, but half the time, a very large chunk of the players playing those games do not engage with the plot at all and just go around doing random shit. And it does sort of raise the question, like, why have the game? Is it if you're not going to engage with the like core element of it, or is it fine that you're doing that? It's a very clever way to draw attention to a lot of the way we engage with games as storytelling.
Yeah, it's a really common thing. I would almost say it's actually even more common with non-open world games, because open world games expect you to meander and not worry about the main plot a certain amount a lot of the time. But you get a lot of games where just because there's more than literally one thing you can do, that people are doing anything but progressing the thing, which is a fun, important way of exploring games. Eventually, but always strikes a little weird and feels like missing the point when that's the first or the only way someone wants to experience something. It's like,
I feel like
then
it's
it's
less
like,
prominent though in like things with a more linear, clear-cut story than it is in something like an open world game, because with a linear narrative, there's only so much fucking around you can do.
Yeah, it makes me think of things like playing the older Halo games and people who will absolutely not just walk forward and do the combat and shoot the aliens. They have to find all the weird, crazy, nonsensical spots they can jump to, or the weird things they can explore, which, like I said, to a point is great because the developers hide things and they think about that. But when that's what you want to do from the very first time, and you just outwardly never want to move forward and do the thing you're supposed to do, I feel like sometimes people who develop games like that, especially because they are much more crafted and directly trying to do something than most of the open world games are, probably get a similar kind of frustration to the narrator, where it's like, oh, look at all these people who aren't talking about the game. They're talking about this weird glitch you can find with this texture that doesn't work way off to the side corner that you have to Skyrim your way up a mountain to get to, and you're not even supposed to be able to see.
As an onlooker, it always frustrates the hell out of me. Like, when people play a game and just don't interact with the game itself, and just start looking around for all these other things instead of engaging with the plot. It's also why, like, in an open world setting, one of my least favorite things to do is exploration or like collectible hunting and stuff like that. I just want to get to the plot. Which is funny because, like, I watched a playthrough of a bunch of the possible endings you could get for the remake, the remaster of Stanley Parable, just to refresh my memory on a lot of it before I did some other research on it and stuff like that. And I was watching the playthrough from a channel called Secret Sleepover Society. And
it's a good name.
Yeah, it's great. And the hosts are fantastic. They're very entertaining. And the one who's playing it is infamous for doing all kinds of weird shit when she's playing, much to the frustration of her partner. to the point that, like, watching this, he's sitting there going, I understand that this is how this particular game is meant to be played. You're meant to try everything just to see what happens, and still it is driving me insane.
Oh, I've been there.
And that's, in a nutshell, the point of the Stanley Parable, is we've put you in a sandbox and given you the illusion of choice. We are pushing you to make these decisions, we're motivating you to make decisions, but in reality, all of this is programmed into the game, and you don't truly have that many options. You only have the options we have given you.
Yep. That's why sandbox ends up still continuing to be such a perfect word for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's so many shapes you can make, so many things you can do within that sandbox, but it's still a box you're inside of. You can do what's in the box, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. And it gets communicated so much better because of the narrator prompting you to make choices, or rather, because we are all so contrarian when it comes to gaming, trying desperately to keep you on track to play the story he has set forth for you. When you go off course, which you inevitably will, because you have this illusion of freedom of choice.
Props to Slay the Princess for turning that mentality into a literal voice named the Contrarian.
Yes, you mentioned that in the last episode. Which I need to look into that game. It sounds very funny.
It is, especially when the narrator just starts getting ignored for a minute or two while the regular player, quote-unquote, voice and the Contrarian talk to each other about what they are going to do next.
And that's a good thing. That's a good place to get into this next part, which is interesting. Because the way you've talked about the Contrarian and the character as these two voices in the same head, I came across a thing that made me go, huh, that's an interesting theory, and it does make a lot of sense. There is two ways you can interpret the story of the Stanley Parable, or rather, the character of the narrator.
Ooh.
You can interpret it as it seems, literally at the glance, as the narrator is an external force. The narrator is an external entity who is manipulating the story that Stanley exists within. Allegedly for Stanley, although I would argue the reality is it's to give himself purpose. Or you can view it the inverse, that the narrator is something intrinsic to Stanley, a part of him or his own inner voice, the representation of Stanley's imagination that he is using to get through the monotony of this just tedious job that he has.
I mean, I won't pretend that I've never like thought of things through a voice in my head.
Yeah, I mean, but most of our thoughts for a lot of us are effectively a monologue. And you can interpret the narrator here as basically Stanley's internal monologue, or rather, the embodiment of his imagination, and that all these stories that you can potentially play out are his imaginings to help him get through the day, and that rather than a very sparse physical world, what we're actually dealing with is a very rich and layered internal world.
I mean, good on Stanley, if so.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it's, as I said before, right, the narrator is doing this to give himself purpose. One in either version of this, right? But that version of things is particularly interesting to me because the narrator is effectively the same as Stanley. They are both boxed in and confined to the roles they have been programmed to play in this narrative.
True. Not much else either of them can do.
There's not really anything either of them that they can do. the narrator
Stanley doesn't
can't
even get to
really
hold
go
on to
off
control of
script.
himself. Yes, true.
And Stanley can't really change anything about what he's doing. And I feel like that is an important thing to remember. Because that, depending on if the narrator is external or internal, it changes a lot. Because if it's external, the narrator is manipulating Stanley, this other figure, to fulfill his own purpose. And Stanley, because of your piloting of Stanley, your control of Stanley going off script, is against that purpose. And that causes the narrator, in a lot of scenarios, to existentially break down in some way, or get angry. But if you look at it as the narrator as an internal, intrinsic part of Stanley himself, the criticisms of the narrator become self-criticisms.
True. I hadn't actually thought about that angle.
Yeah, I stumbled across the concept for that, like that theory, in like a video essay when I was doing some extra research. Because I've played the original Stanley Parable, and I've watched a playthrough of the remake, but there's so many possible endings and things that I wanted to try and get a broader view without committing hours upon hours to going through it again. And this person, their whole video was this concept, basically, this theory. And it makes a lot of sense to me.
It's got a strong foundation.
See, I'm very tired at the time of recording this, and I feel like I'm not doing it justice, and also I can't remember what the essay was, but I think if you just search, like, Stanley Parable video essay, you'll probably find it. It's like 7 minutes long, I think. But it makes it clear, right, that how integral the narrator is to this narrative, metanarrative as it may be, because how you view the narrator, if they are an external force or an internal part of Stanley, completely recontextualizes the game, and by an extension, its story. Either way, it's commentary on the nature of choice, at least in the original version.
Yeah, it's always fun to look at real games of choice like this, and I enjoy seeing the differences between what people think about how it works and why.
Yeah, I feel like that narrative, that idea of the internal Stanley as the narrator, does break down a little bit in the remake, remaster, whichever you want to call it, because that's no longer focused so much on choice. That is in there. You can play that, but also there is this emphasis on, substance and sequels and things like that, which doesn't tie into that narrative as well.
It's a soulless sequel, so it's just destroying the original message of the game. That's all. Easy.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is an option. But it feels weird to me to consider it from the angle of the internal Stanley, then, if it's Stanley just ruminating on soulless sequels. Unless we're just assuming he's gotten a new job, but it's clearly the same office.
Maybe he's run out of creative ideas to keep himself busy with, so he's come back for what is essentially the soulless sequel to his own mental meanderings.
Quite possibly. That's not to say
maybe that's what going back to work feels like. A soulless sequel.
I mean, that is a fair point. It very much can if you don't like your job. Or if you're just having a rough patch with work even. But, yeah, I don't think it completely discounts the theory, necessarily. But I think it does sort of weaken it a bit. But I like the theory, because it completely changes how you feel about the narrator.
Oh yeah. It puts him in an entirely different perspective.
Because it stops becoming, Stanley, why are you doing this to me? It becomes, why am I doing this to myself?
What is going on?
why can't I just stick to the script and make this go easily? Why am I so determined to push against the grain for this, just to experience a taste of this illusory freedom when I know it's not real, you know?
Yeah, and it becomes this more direct of, oh, I'm very literally not in control of my body anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing as well. It becomes, especially with the fourth wall break, it's a realization of, oh, I'm not actually in control of my life and none of this matters. Which is actually kind of dark for such a funny, like, lighthearted, whimsical almost game. And I think that checks out because it is very existential when you really think about it. And it always has that kind of subtly heavy and uncomfortable atmosphere.
Oh yeah, there's no escaping it. Not in a setting like that. Hell, that's probably part of why it takes place in an office.
Yeah, I mean, the very first time I played through it and like got my first couple of endings, I was always waiting for like the moment to hit when I was like, oh, this is a horror game, and it never hit. Not really. It was always a comedy, but the horror is always there because existentialism, it's weighty. It doesn't matter like what genre you put it in. If there's existentialism present, it's gonna get felt in a very tangible, almost way. And the narrator is constantly drawing your attention to this.
He's just doing his best and trying to get through the day.
Honestly, yeah, as is Stanley, whether, to be fair, that they could be the same guy, as we've established, but that's one of the things that I think is so good about the storytelling in the Stanley Parable and the narrator in that game is that it's the narrator that makes all of these things hit home. The statements about choice, the statements about sequels, the meta-narrative, the possible connections with Stanley, all of these things are tied together through the narrator. I said it earlier, this game would not function without the narrator, and at a mechanical level, that's not true. You could program it exactly the same and just not have the narrator there, but it wouldn't be engaging and entertaining, and it wouldn't make you think in the same way. It would just be wandering around until you got bored.
Yeah, because ultimately the game's not about interacting with your environment. It's about interacting with the narrator, and the environment is just your tool for doing that.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost a conversation more than a game. Like, you don't get to have any dialogue options toward the narrator, but everything you do is to prompt the narrator to say something else and keep that interaction going.
Yeah, there's nothing stopping you from playing Stanley like, ooh, what's next? I want to see. But nothing else in the game is half so interesting as the narrator. The narrator is the flavor.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, I think a lot of people do still miss the point behind it all and do just play it to see all the funny endings. But the fact that that is happening only contributes to the meta-narrative.
That it does.
And in fact, it's basically the exact same situation as Stanley and the narrator, assuming they're separate entities, but given physical, actual form of. It's that idea again of, look, we made this game. It is art. It is making a philosophical point about choice in the storytelling of games, and you're just playing to see the funny shit that might happen and not paying attention to that. Like, it's layered in on itself so many times over. It's one of the most meta things I have ever experienced as a story.
Yeah, it's like a paper mache ball, and every single paper that's glued into that ball is another page of an essay. There's a lot to find, a lot to think about, a lot to be said.
But it's gotten to a point, right, where I feel like when people start talking about meta-narratives, like, the standard go-to example is Don Quixote. Because the whole point of that story is that those heroic characters could never really exist in reality. And we would look at them a lot like people look at Don Quixote.
It would come off as a little crazy.
But when I think the first thing I think of when I think of a meta narrative as storytelling is the Stanley Parable, because it really leans into the meta part for one thing.
True.
And because of the medium it is chosen and the things it's choosing to talk about, it's just so well constructed.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing where the layer of separation between the narrative and the meta-narrative is so thin with the Stanley Parable, because you could argue that the meta-narrative is the point.
I mean, it is, without question. I think that's the point.
The actual narrative is just kind of there and almost nothing of no substance. You can do it. There's nothing stopping you. Hell, that's what the narrator wants you to do, but it's not.
It's one of the endings.
But it's so far off the point and the meaning, but in a way that, because of what the meaning and the point actually is, also fits right in.
Yeah. But I mean, it's like I said earlier on the episode, right? Calling it the Stanley Parable is a very accurate title, because the meta-narrative is the point, and the story itself is very simple with no real context, but to say it has no substance is a little inaccurate, amusingly enough, given the whole point of the sequel. Because the whole point is the sort of using this very simple framework to make you think of these complex things.
It does it incredibly well.
Yeah, I mean, everything the narrator says is to prompt you to make a choice. Even in the new, shiny, improved remaster with all its focus on, sequels and remakes and substance and all that, it's still a choice there if you want to engage with the new or just do all the old stuff again.
Yeah.
Everything the narrator does is to push you to make those choices or to make those points.
Well, yep, and it's all he can do. It's the only way he can express himself upon the world. Talking to you.
And chances are you're going to ignore him, the poor bastard.
If you're stuck in an office, he's stuck in a voice booth.
Yeah.
He's not allowed to leave.
But yeah, it's funny, like, for such a complex topic, there's not a lot you can really say about it once you get to the, crux of what the parable is.
Yeah, it quite literally speaks for itself.
As all good parables should. But it felt wrong to do an episode about narrators and perspectives and not do the Stanley Parable. Because
it is a quintessential narrator game.
Exactly the thing I was about to say, dead ass exactly that wording even. It's the story that comes to my mind when I think of narrators, specifically because it is entirely about the narrator. Even though the narrator says it's about Stanley, and arguably, in a meta-narrative context, it's about you. From just an engagement perspective, it's the narrator that keeps you coming back. Whether it's to spite him just to see what he does, or what, or because it's funny or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just the ultimate narrator experience.
Yeah, exactly. You know what you're coming here for. It's what you're gonna get. Hope you like it.
But yeah, again, a bit of an experimental episode this time. There's honestly, again, once we've made basically all the points we could, there's not a lot to say about the game, even though it is so well done. It is such a clever meta-narrative. Once you've got that out there, there really isn't much more to say about it. So we can probably leave that one there, and we'll see how it goes, this more experimental episode.
Just anybody who is somehow interested in all these topics without ever having experienced the Stanley Parable, go do it. It's literally made for this.
And it's not the cheapest game ever, but it's not like expensive either or anything like that. So if you have a bit of disposable money around somehow in modern society, it's definitely worth picking up. It's a fun experience, even if you aren't super invested in the whole meta-narrative idea. But now that we've drawn your attention to it, it is my hope that if you do go and play it again, you're going to realize all these things, and it will give you a greater appreciation for how cleverly written it actually is.
Yeah, and I'm sure the game goes on sale often enough.
Probably. But yes, until next time, you can, as always, find these episodes either on Google Podcasts or Spotify if you were there on my site, or vice versa if you are finding it over on one of those places. I also upload the episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com, where I also will post the transcripts from the stories we do during the podcast, as well as a couple of other little bits of writing, stories, poetry, that sort of thing every now and then. And I've been doing some blog and article posts as well, just as another way to share my ramblings on storytelling.
Yeah, listen to the rambles.
Also on social media, I'm on the website formerly known as Twitter as Daniel Writes 7, and I'm still claiming to be on Blue Sky as Radford Writes, despite barely interacting with it.
It's there.
It's there. I posted a link there today.
Ooh.
Yeah, to the first episode of this of this season. Yeah, and of course you will see plenty more of John doing assorted narration for me and appearing on these podcasts, and doing his own thing, because you can plug that now. Yep.
I stream at Sephir on Twitch, SEPHEAR. Not much up yet, because I had the wonderful luck the past week of working 8 days straight. But I'm going to be streaming at least once every time I have a day or two off from now on. Sometimes probably even on nights after work, but that's going to be a little less consistent.
And as we have already established, he's clearly a very entertaining individual, so you should go check that out.
Yes, please do. Let me entertain you as much as possible, as many of you as possible. And, I'm something of a narrator myself.
That's what you've established. Okay, we're leaving. Goodbye.